Off the cold coast of Maine, a former Navy sailor inherits what everyone calls worthless an old house on Carter Ledge and a German shepherd named Scout. But when storms rise and secrets hidden under stone begin to surface, he discovers this isolated rock is more than a refuge. It's a vault of Cold War intelligence and a national security stronghold. Greed, betrayal, and loyalty collide as even family turns against him. Want to know how far one man and his dog will go to protect the truth? Hit like and subscribe for the full story. The air in Sterling and Pike Attorneys at Law smelled like lemon polish and old money, the kind that had forgotten its own history. Jack Carter stood just inside the paneled doorway, shoulders squared out of habit, a man who had learned to hold still on a pitching deck and in rooms where people measured each other by what they wore on their wrists. He kept his hands at his sides, fingers relaxed, and let his eyes make a slow circuit of the office. One door to the hall, 2 windows facing Congress Street, a brass letter opener on the credenza that could do real damage if someone panicked a crystal decanter that looked heavier than it needed to be. Across from the desk, Evan Miller slouched into a leather chair like it owed him rent, his tailored jacket tugging at the seams, his expression half smile, half countdown. Jack didn't return it. He caught his reflection in the window, late 30s hair clipped short, a face cut by weather and time, and looked away before memory could climb out of the glass. On the floor beside Jack's chair, Scout lay with his head on his paws, chest rising slow and steady, a gray and tan German shepherd who carried himself like a quiet oath. The receptionist had asked if the dog would be fine, and Jack had said yes. Scout had been fine in all kinds of places, from narrow passageways to storm-tossed decks, and this office wouldn't test him. "Mr. Carter." "Thank you for coming," said Harold Sterling, white-haired and careful, the kind of lawyer who handled wills because he believed the dead deserved accuracy. "Mr. Miller," he added with a nod that didn't bend an inch. Evan lifted his hand in a casual salute and then rapped his knuckles on the armrest, a little drumbeat of impatience. The walls carried framed photos of Maine harbors in winter, lobster boats riding low, a frost of salt on the rails, water the color of steel. Jack let them take him back to a calmer place. The way a dock creaked, the way rope smelled after rain, and then Mr. Sterling began. He read the small things first, because that's how these moments go, personal items to a church, thrift beloved tools, to an old friend named Jed Harris, a few charitable bequests that Henry Carter had arranged without fanfare. Jack's jaw softened a notch. He'd known Henry as a stern outline against the doorway of a workshop, a voice that carried more gravel than warmth, a man who lived by tide tables and weather radios. They hadn't spoken much in the last decade, not after Jack enlisted in the Navy and then stayed past his mother's patience, past the family's comfort with what that life took out of a person. Evan leaned forward when the numbers arrived. Shares in a logistics company. Henry had once helped launch, transferred to Evan Free and Clear, a commercial parcel near Portland Evan again, a money market account Evan with a trustee appointed to unwind the taxes. The attorney's voice never moved out of the middle register, but the room felt louder just the same. Jack breathed through it like riding out a squall count. The seconds between thunder and strike let the noise pass. Scout's ears shifted once and settled. And finally, Mr. Sterling said, removing a folded page from a blue folder, "The real property, known as Carter Ledge Structures and Appurtenances, conveys to your grandson, Jack Carter, together with all contents in situ." The decedent further directs that the animal known as Scout remain with Jack Carter as part of said bequest. Evan's laugh was a soft burst of disbelief. "The rock, that shack on a rock. He left me the city property and gave Jack a splintered birdhouse in the Atlantic." The attorney didn't look at him. Jack's gaze stayed on the paper. Carter Ledge. He hadn't been there since he was a teenager. A sullen summer when Henry had taken him out in a chugging workboat to a tooth of granite sitting a mile off the mid-coast, the house on top like a stiff hat in a nor'easter. The memory came layered diesel smoke gulls. Henry's hand steady on the tiller. There is also a letter Sterling said, passing a separate envelope across the desk. Mr. Carter, your grandfather asked that I give this to you at the conclusion of the reading. Jack slipped it into his jacket without looking down. You've got to be kidding, Evan said, turning toward him now with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. He leaves me the living assets and sticks you with the rehab job. Maybe bring a hammer and a prayer. Jack let the words fall to the floor. He read the currents under them instead, Evan's fingers tapping faster, his glance slicing to the window, to the folder, back to the envelope tucked against Jack's chest. Interest. The kind that pretends to be humor until it needs a sharper tool. Carter Ledge is not habitable, Evan added, as if that settled the matter. It's a hazard. He should have condemned it. Mr. Sterling removed his glasses and polished them on a handkerchief that looked older than half the city. Your grandfather made arrangements for modest upkeep. He paid a caretaker to check the structure, and the Coast Guard has a record of safe landings on days when seas allowed. The house stands, Mr. Miller. To what end? Evan asked. We're not museum people. To the end Mr. Carter intended, the attorney replied. A place is not useless simply because it stands alone. The room held its breath. Jack felt something lift against his palm. Scout's nose nudged his fingers, once a small weight and anchor. Jack closed his hand around that steady warmth and pictured the ledge as if it were an old chart, the narrow cut on the lee side where a boat might tuck in on a rising tide, the black seam of wet rock that meant footing would be treacherous the way wind funneled up the face and battered anything that didn't bow to it. He heard Henry's voice from that long-ago day. Not much to look at, Jackie, but it'll outlast any of us, spoken like a man who loved the plain truth. There's also a maintenance trust. Mr. Sterling continued to fund basic supplies and transport. Not lavish. Sufficient. Your grandfather left practical things in practical amounts. Evan stood pacing 2 strides to the window and back. He smiled toward Jack the way men do when they intend to minimize you. Well, congratulations. You and the dog get the longest commute in Maine. He reached for the decanter, shrugged when Sterling didn't protest, and poured a little too much. Here's to the rock. Jack didn't take the invitation. He had learned in the service that some toasts are ways to mark territory, and he was done surrendering rooms he had a right to stand in. Instead, he asked the question the room had been dancing around. Why me? Mr. Sterling folded his hands. Because Henry Carter said you would understand what to do when a place asks for a quiet keeper. His phrase, not mine. The words hung there like a bell still ringing after the hammer let go. Jack imagined the house again, high and gray, the ocean shouldering itself against that stone as if it had all eternity to try. A quiet keeper. He wasn't sure what fit inside those 2 words, but the shape felt familiar in his chest. Mr. Miller, the attorney added, there is a codicil requesting that you refrain from contesting the bequest. Your grandfather believed you had enough to manage on shore. Evan set the glass down with care. Requesting, he repeated, working the word. He looked at the dog. That animal's trained, he said, as if he'd just remembered to be curious. He didn't even blink when the door slammed. Scout knows his job, Jack said. Evan's eyes flicked from the shepherd to Jack's boots to the envelope to Mr. Sterling's placid face. Enjoy your ocean view, he said finally. Let me know if you find a pot of gold under those floorboards. His tone made gold sound like proof. He buttoned his jacket and left the scent of his cologne thinning as the door latched. Silence returned to the paneling and the rugs and the thick glass that looked out on a bright, cold Portland afternoon. Mr. Sterling waited a moment and then slid a manila folder across the desk. Charts to Carter Ledge. A note with the caretaker's name, Jed Harris. He runs a small boat out of Port Clyde. and the key to the boathouse your grandfather leased on the municipal pier. You'll find some supplies in there. Tools, mostly." Jack nodded. He kept his voice even. "Did my grandfather ever say why he stayed away from the family so long?" The lawyer's lined face softened. He spoke rarely and only in short sentences, but he said once that the mainland had too much noise for the kind of listening he wanted to do. Jack glanced down at Scout, who met his eyes with that steady amber calm. Listening. The word moved through him like a tide turning. He stood, shook Sterling's hand, and thanked him. On the way out, the receptionist reached for a biscuit in a small jar and asked if Scout could have one. Jack nodded. Scout took it gently, as if he knew about old offices and the way kindness survives in them. Outside, the air had the clean bite of early spring. Jack tucked the envelope deeper into his jacket and started for the truck, the shepherd keeping pace at his knee. He thought of Henry's handwriting, the tight slant of a man who planned for weather, and he didn't open the letter yet. Some words are better read with water in sight. He slid into the driver's seat, Scout hopping to the bench beside him, and looked east where the sky thinned toward the ocean. He gave the horn a polite tap to clear a delivery van easing out of an alley, then turned toward I-295 and the miles that would take him down the coast to Port Clyde to Jed Harris, to a boathouse key that suddenly felt heavier than its metal. The rules of his old life came back without needing to be called move steady. Count your breaths. Trust the dog who reads the air before you do. He did not look in the rearview mirror to see if Evan had stepped out onto the sidewalk to watch him go. Instead, he rolled down the window an inch, let the cold air wash the interior of the cab, and told Scout what he always told him before they headed toward something uncertain. "Keep your eyes up, partner." Scout lifted his head and listened to the direction of the wind. Jack followed the dog's gaze toward a horizon he couldn't see and drove. The drive from Portland to Port Clyde had carried Jack Carter down winding coastal roads where spruce trees leaned into the sky and the smell of salt grew stronger with every mile. By the time he reached the fishing town, the late afternoon light had thinned into a pale wash over the harbor boats tugging at their lines as if impatient for night. Jed Harris was waiting on the pier shoulders, squared under a heavy wool sweater. His weathered face turned toward the water, the way old mariners listened for change. Jack introduced himself, gave the man a firm handshake, and explained that he had come for the key and the passage Henry Carter had arranged. Jed nodded once, as if he had expected this moment, and led him down the pier to a boat that had seen years, but carried itself well in the water. Scout followed silent tail low, every step steady. The trip across the mile of gray sea was cold, the engine coughing to life and then settling into its rhythm. Jack stood near the bow with Scout pressed against his leg. The wind tugging at his jacket eyes locked on the silhouette that grew larger with each wave. Carter Ledge rose out of the Atlantic like a clenched fist, dark rock streaked with yellow moss, its sides sheer except for a narrow cut that offered a landing. On the highest point, crouched against the sky, was the house weather-beaten, leaning slightly, yet stubborn in its place. Memories of his grandfather's voice surfaced, the tone clipped and practical. Not much to look at, but it will outlast you if you respect it. As they neared the ledge, Jack noted details. His eyes had been trained to catch new rope tied at the mooring posts, boards patched along the side of the landing, even a metal cleat that showed less rust than it should have after years of storms. Someone had been here not long ago, someone who cared enough to keep it standing. Jed guided the boat toward the sheltered cove, cut the engine, and let the swell push them gently until the hull tapped against the stone. Jack rose, stretching stiff legs, and Scout stood at his side, ears alert but relaxed. The dog made no sign of unease, no bark, no growl. Instead, he stepped onto the slick rock with the confidence of one returning home. Jack followed his boots, slipping slightly before finding purchase, and the cold spray of seawater touched his face. Jed handed up the duffel bag and a crate of supplies Henry had prepaid for, then leaned on the rail. "This place takes a certain kind of patience," the fisherman said, his voice carrying above the surf. "Your grandfather thought you might have it." Jack gave a nod, tightened the strap on his bag, and led Scout up the rough path that climbed toward the house. The climb was steep stone cut by years of storms, slick with moss. Scout took the lead, nose lifted to the windtail, sweeping once as if encouraging his partner upward. At the crest, Jack paused to study the house up close. The siding was grayed and warped, yet a few boards had been replaced. Nails shone faintly where the hammer had struck in recent months. The porch sagged, but new rope had been wound tightly around one corner post to brace it. He stepped onto the porch and felt the weight of history in the boards beneath him, the sound of water booming against rock far below. He tried the door and found it stiff but not locked. Inside, the air was heavy with salt and old wood, yet not abandoned. A broom leaned against the wall, its bristles worn but upright. A table bore the marks of recent sanding, not the deep cracks of neglect. Dust lay thin, not thick, as though someone had brushed it away not long ago. Jack set down the duffel and crouched, running a hand across the floor, then looked at Scout. The shepherd's ears pricked forward, eyes scanning the dim corners, but there was no alarm in his stance. He walked a slow circle through the room, paused by the window, and pressed his nose against the glass as if recognizing the view. Jack followed, seeing the ocean stretch in all directions, restless and endless, and wondered what Henry had heard in its voice that kept him here all those years. Evening came fast on the water clouds, pushing in low the color of lead. Jack unpacked a lantern from the crate, lit it, and the glow filled the room with a softer kind of life. He explored the small kitchen where tins were stacked in order labels turned outward. He checked the sleeping loft where the mattress had been turned, the blanket folded with a sailor's precision. Everywhere he looked, the same pattern appeared: decay halted by care, ruin slowed by a hand that understood what mattered. Scout lay by the hearth tail, resting on the floor, eyes following Jack without worry, only watchfulness. Jack sat on the edge of the chair and opened Henry's letter at last. The handwriting was tight and exact, the words chosen like tools. Henry wrote that Carter Ledge had been more than shelter. It had been a station of listening, a place to understand the rhythms of the sea and the truths that others ignored. He wrote that he trusted Jack to stand where he could not, to keep what others would discard. The final line read, "The dog knows the way. Treat him as you would a shipmate." Jack folded the letter, slid it back into the envelope, and rubbed Scout's neck. The shepherd lifted his head, leaned into the touch, and closed his eyes for a moment, as if to confirm what Henry had written. Jack's mind ran over the small details, the fresh rope, the patched boards, the orderly supplies. Someone had been tasked with care, but Scout's calm behavior suggested something deeper. The dog moved as though every step was a return, not a discovery. That meant training. That meant intention. Outside, the wind rose and the waves struck harder against the base of the rock. Jack tightened the shutters, checked the lantern, and settled in for the night. He knew storms would come often, and solitude would test him in ways the Navy never had. But as Scout curled near the hearth and the sea's rhythm pounded through the stone, Jack felt a steadiness grow inside. The house was not abandoned. The dog was not confused. The inheritance was more than a broken structure. He closed his eyes, hearing the dog breathe, and understood that the first step had been taken, but the path ahead was longer than the tide. Jack woke the next morning to the sound of gulls wheeling over the ledge and the steady hush of waves striking the stone far below. The house smelled of salt and wood smoke from the lantern wick he had let burn low through the night. Scout stirred at the foot of the chair, ears twitching as light filled the single room. Jack stood, stretched, and walked a slow circuit through the small house, running his hands over the warped beams, studying the way the place had been held together through stubborn effort. He found a bucket by the door, filled it with collected rainwater from the barrel outside, and rinsed his face, the cold bite of it pulling him fully awake. As he dried his hands on a rag, he noticed Scout pacing along one side of the room, nose close to the floor, tail stiff. The dog stopped near a section of wall where the boards had gone soft with damp, pressed his nose against the wood, and gave a low growl that was not anger, but alert. Jack crouched, laying a palm against the wall, feeling the faint give beneath his hand. "What do you see, boy?" he asked quietly, though he knew Scout's instincts did not often lie. The shepherd pawed once claws, scraping, then looked back with a sharp glance, urging Jack to act. Jack reached for the small pry bar from the supply crate, wedged it gently between two planks, and levered until the nail gave with a whispering creak. The board shifted, and behind it was a narrow cavity no wider than a handspan. The air that came out smelled dry, untouched by the damp of the room. He reached inside, fingers brushing against something wrapped tight. Drawing it out, he set it on the table in the lantern's morning light. It was a book bound in oilskin edges, darkened by time, but still supple, the careful wrapping designed to resist salt and years. Jack laid his hand on the cover for a moment before untying the knots. Scout sat beside him, ears forward, eyes fixed. Inside were pages filled with handwriting that marched in tight, deliberate lines across the paper. The ink had faded to brown, but remained legible. He turned the first few pages and felt the weight of precision. These were not personal musings. They were records. Tidal patterns measured to the minute currents drawn with arrows across hand-sketched charts, radio frequencies noted in columns, coded signals logged with dates. The entries stretched back more than 20 years. Jack read one aloud, softly. June 14th. Tide unusually fast on the ebb cross-current near the northern shoal, stronger than predicted. Vessel identified by call sign 3 miles east. Signal interference noted. He closed the book slowly, a chill running along his arms. This was not idle curiosity. Henry Carter had been listening, watching, recording the sea with the focus of a man working a mission. Jack thought of his grandfather's silence in family gatherings, the way he had seemed distant, always listening to something no one else could hear. Now Jack could see it. The man had been keeping a watch alone, disciplined and deliberate. He flipped further through the book and saw columns that referenced Navy codes he half remembered from his own service. Henry had not been cut off from his past. He had been continuing it on his own terms. Scout rested his head on Jack's knee, warm weight steadying him as he turned another page. The dog's calm presence seemed to confirm what the book revealed, as if Henry had trained him not only for loyalty, but for recognition of the hidden. Jack realized this discovery explained the upkeep, the patched boards, the fresh rope. Someone had ensured the house survived so the records inside could be found. He set the book down carefully, replaced the pry bar in the crate, and leaned back in the chair. The sound of the sea came through the wall, steady and endless. He thought of the years Henry had spent here, not idly staring at waves, but cataloging them, decoding the voices carried through water and air. Jack closed his eyes, letting the rhythm sink in, and felt the beginning of understanding. This inheritance was not about property. It was about purpose. Scout shifted, lifting his head to the door as if to remind Jack that the day was moving, that discovery was only the first step. Jack rose, tucked the oilskin book into his pack, and checked the shutters against the wind. He knew he would need to go deeper to see if more waited in the bones of this house, if the silence his grandfather had chosen held more voices yet to be uncovered. Outside, the tide was falling, exposing black rock slick with weed, and the gulls wheeled lower, their cries sharper. Jack felt the pull of questions rising as steady as the water's return. He gave Scout a nod and stepped back into the gray light, already thinking of what else might be hidden, where only a trained eye or a loyal dog would point the way. The storm rolled in, without warning, the kind of sudden squall that men at sea always feared, because it carried no patience for hesitation. Jack Carter had learned long ago to respect such weather, to feel the change in pressure, and the restless shift of wind before the first strike of rain. That night, the Atlantic raged against Carter Ledge, with a force that rattled the windows and sent sprays of salt water clawing up the walls. Jack secured the shutters, checked the lantern, and kept his pack close in case he needed to move quickly. Scout circled the room twice and settled near the hearth, his amber eyes glinting in the dim light. The hours dragged, each gust pressing harder against the house, and Jack forced himself to read more of the oilskin book to steady his mind. Then, without warning, Scout rose. The shepherd's body stiffened, ears pitched forward, and he padded to the stone hearth with measured steps. He let out a long, mournful howl that cut through the roar of the storm. Jack set the book down instantly because he knew from years of service that a trained dog never made such a sound without reason. "What is it, boy?" Jack asked, his voice low. Scout pressed his nose against the base of the hearth, pawed once, then again with insistence, claws scraping against stone. Jack moved closer, running his hands along the surface of the cold granite. At first it felt solid, unyielding, but when he pressed near the left edge, he caught a faint shift beneath his palm. The stone rocked just slightly, almost imperceptibly, yet enough to reveal it was not fixed as it appeared. His pulse quickened. He fetched the small pry bar from his pack and returned, pushing Scout gently aside, though the dog refused to retreat far. With a steady grip, he wedged the bar into the seam and heaved. The stone groaned against years of weight, then lifted with reluctant surrender, revealing a cavity dark and dry beneath the hearth. Jack lowered the lantern, its glow spilling into the space. Nestled inside was a metal box, edges corroded but still sealed tight against time and damp. He lifted it out, heavy in his hands, water streaking from the surface where condensation had formed. Scout watched silently, his breath slow and measured, as if waiting for Jack to uncover the truth his instincts had already recognized. Jack set the box on the table, studied the latch, and worked it open with careful pressure. Inside lay a bundle wrapped in oilcloth secured with waxed string. He unwrapped it slowly, revealing folded charts of the Maine coastline drawn by hand with astonishing detail. Every channel, shoal, and hidden cove was marked in Henry Carter's precise handwriting. Alongside the maps was an envelope sealed in wax. Jack broke the seal and unfolded the letter. The handwriting was the same steady script, every line drawn with the authority of a man who knew storms and silence. "Jack," the letter began. "If you are reading this, then you have chosen to look where others would not. This house, this rock, and the waters around it are not an inheritance of comfort, but of responsibility. Only one who understands the sea can guard it. Trust the dog. He has been trained to guide you where I cannot. Remember, only those who respect the silence of the ocean should hold this place. The rest will try to take it for what they think it is worth. You must see what it truly is." Jack sat back, the words tightening around him like rigging pulled taut. He looked at Scout, who tilted his head slightly as if to remind him that Henry's trust had always included the dog. Jack folded the letter and replaced it in the box with the charts. He felt the weight of his grandfather's intent pressing against him, now heavier than the storm outside. The inheritance was not a crumbling house on a rock. It was the duty to protect something larger, something that required silence, vigilance, and loyalty. The storm raged on, battering the shutters and howling across the roof. But inside the house, Jack felt a calm grow in his chest. He was beginning to understand why Henry had lived alone here, why he had turned his back on family gatherings and city comforts. The sea demanded more than attention. It demanded devotion. Scout settled back at Jack's feet, eyes half closed but body alert, ready to rise if called again. Jack replaced the stone over the cavity with care, knowing this discovery would not be the last. He poured a little water into Scout's bowl, checked the lantern once more, and sat back down with the map spread before him. The lines of the coast seemed to shimmer in the lantern light, pointing not to wealth, but to secrets worth keeping. Outside, the storm began to shift, the tide pulling back, the waves changing rhythm. Jack felt the house breathe with the stone beneath it, as if the ledge itself approved that the hidden box had found the right hands. He leaned back, eyes tracing the handwriting on the charts, and realized that every mark was a conversation between Henry and the sea, a conversation he was now meant to continue. The storm passed by dawn, leaving the air washed clean and sharp, the sea rolling heavy swells that glittered under the pale light. Jack Carter stepped outside the house, boots crunching on wet rock, and breathed deep as if the Atlantic had drawn a curtain back just for him. The night's discovery still pressed on his mind. He carried the iron box to the porch table where the morning sun would allow him to read Henry's letter more clearly. Scout followed close, tail moving once with slow rhythm, then sat at Jack's feet watchful. Jack unfolded the letter again, smoothing the pages against the table, and began to read every line with care. The handwriting, though steady, carried an undercurrent of urgency. Jack, it began. I was once a man who believed in service, who believed that listening to the sea was a way to protect lives. I was an acoustic engineer with the Navy. My work was simple in its design, complex in its execution. I built instruments to hear what lay beneath the waves, to read the deep voices that travel farther than sight. What I learned and what I gave them was meant to shield, not to strike. But men in offices saw otherwise. They saw targets where I saw warnings. They saw advantage where I saw preservation. I could not stay in a uniform that asked me to weaponize what should have been a watchman's lantern. Jack paused, the words ringing with the cadence of truth. He remembered the old brief mentions Henry had made, tossed like pebbles into conversation about service years, but never explained. Now it unfolded with sharp edges. His grandfather had not left the Navy quietly. He had walked away in disagreement. Jack read on. When I left, I brought only what I could carry in my head and my hands. I used this rock because it was shaped by nature for what I needed: a place to anchor sound, a place to test the currents, a place where a man could listen without interference. I knew the family would not understand, and they did not. Some mocked, some ignored, some waited for me to fail. But I found steadiness in silence. If you hold this letter, you are the one I trusted to understand why. The pages rustled in the sea breeze. Jack steadied them with his hand, his eyes narrowing at the next lines. Do not trust the family, Jack. They measure value in things they can sell. They would strip this ledge for profit if they could. Do not let them. Trust the dog. He has been raised not just to guard, but to guide. He will sense what you cannot, and he will lead you where the stone hides its truth. Jack leaned back, staring at Scout. The shepherd tilted his head, amber eyes reflecting the sunlight. Jack rubbed behind his ears and whispered, He meant you, partner. You're the one carrying his compass. Scout pressed his nose into Jack's hand, a warm weight that seemed to seal the promise. Jack folded the letter carefully and placed it back into the box with the maps, his mind heavy with the weight of this new knowledge. Henry had not simply been a reclusive old mariner. He had been a man of science, a man of principle who had chosen exile over compromise. Jack walked back inside, set the box on the table, and opened one of the charts. Lines stretched across the page in neat arcs, currents marked in detail. Notes in the margin referred to sound paths, wave echoes, and even coded references to frequencies Jack half recognized from his own naval days. His grandfather had been working alone, but had not been lost. He had been continuing his service in his own way. Jack thought of Evan, then his cousin's mocking smile, his dismissive words at the lawyer's office. He heard Henry's warning again. Do not trust the family. The truth sharpened Evan's hunger for profit would not stop at the shoreline. If he ever guessed there was something more than a ruin here, he would return. Jack tightened his jaw. He had seen men like Evan before, not in family, but in ports across the world, men who mistook greed for courage, who thought ownership meant victory. Such men were always dangerous. He rose and walked the room again, running his hands along the walls, pressing at the seams, listening to the house. He understood now that the building itself was a shell hiding layers of purpose. Scout trailed him closely, pausing to sniff at corners, glancing back as if confirming his role. The shepherd stopped once more at the hearth sat and gave a soft huff as though reminding Jack that secrets here ran deeper than stone. Jack crouched, resting his hand on the dog's shoulder. "All right," he said, his voice calm but firm. "We'll follow where you lead. Your nose, my hands. Together we'll find what he left." Outside gulls wheeled and the tide shifted its rhythm steady against the ledge. Jack carried the maps back to the table, spread them again, and studied every mark, memorizing the lines. He felt the sea's pulse through the rock beneath him, the kind of deep vibration a sailor never forgets. Henry had turned away from command but had not abandoned watch. He had passed it on. Scout curled beside the table, chin resting on his paws, gaze fixed on the door. Jack kept reading until the lantern needed trimming again, the day slipping into gray dusk. The house felt less like a ruin now and more like a vessel with a hidden course. Jack knew the journey had only begun, and the weight of Henry's words promised more to come. The morning broke calm after a restless night. The ocean stretched wide and blue, the horizon softened by a faint haze. Jack Carter was outside tightening the ropes that secured the small supply crate when Scout lifted his head sharply, ears erect, and gave a low growl that pulsed like a warning through the quiet air. Jack followed his gaze toward the water and saw a boat cutting across the swell. It was not Jed's sturdy fishing craft, but a rental skiff, sleek and careless in its approach. Even before the figure at the helm came into clear view, Jack felt the twist in his gut, the anticipation of trouble before it touched shore. Evan Miller stood tall against the spray, his expensive jacket zipped to his chin, his hair combed too neatly for a man at sea. He waved as if visiting for Sunday dinner, not trespassing on another man's ground. Jack didn't wave back. Scout remained beside him, tail-stiff gaze unwavering. The skiff bumped awkwardly against the stone landing ropes tied with hands that had never earned their calluses. Evan climbed out, slipping once, but catching himself, his grin wide as he called Cousin, "What a place you've got here. Thought I'd come see how the old house is treating you." His voice carried with false cheer, brittle at the edges. Jack stood on the path, boots planted firm, waiting as Evan made the climb up the slick rock. The man's eyes moved everywhere, quick and calculating, not with wonder but with search. He reached the porch, brushing salt spray from his jacket, and stepped closer as if expecting a welcome. Jack crossed his arms. "What do you want?" "Evan." Evan raised his brows, feigning surprise. "Can't family drop in? You've got quite the inheritance, and I thought maybe I should check on you. Make sure you're not too lonely out here with only waves and that dog for company." Scout's low growl deepened. Jack placed a hand on the shepherd's neck, steadying him. Evan laughed lightly, though his eyes darted toward the doorway. "May I come in? Just a quick look. I always wondered what grandfather was doing out here. Never made sense, did it? A house on a rock. Who spends their life with tide charts and radios?" Jack didn't move, but he stepped aside just enough to prevent confrontation. If Evan wanted to see, let him see. The truth would reveal itself in what he sought. Inside, Evan's shoes tapped against the old wood, his gaze sweeping the room with sharp hunger. He touched the edge of the table, ran a finger along the window frame, crouched briefly to glance at the hearth. Scout shadowed his every step. Ears forward, body taut. A living barrier between Jack and intrusion. "Not much to look at," Evan said, though his voice had thinned. He looked back over his shoulder. "Unless you've already found the old man's notes." Jack's eyes narrowed. "What notes?" Evan straightened his grin, returning too quickly. "Oh, you know. The journals. The maps. All those little obsessions of his. He spent a fortune buying equipment, filing shipping invoices, building who knows what out here. I thought maybe he kept a record. He always wrote things down." Jack held his silence, letting the words hang. He had not told Evan about the oilskin book, the iron box, the maps hidden beneath the stone. Yet Evan spoke as though he knew exactly what had been concealed. That meant only one thing. Evan had gone digging into financial ledgers, traced supply shipments, and followed the paper trail Henry had left behind. Evan's voice grew more certain. You know banks keep better files than families. I had some accountants look at grandfather's expenses. Odd bills. Marine equipment, reinforced steel, even payments to Jed Harris. Doesn't sound like a retirement hobby, does it? Sounds more like a project. And projects always leave assets. Assets worth finding. Jack felt the steady thrum of anger beneath his ribs, but kept his face still. Scout moved closer, planting himself between the cousin's teeth bared just enough to glint in the dim light. Evan stepped back slightly, his smile faltering. Easy there. No harm meant. I just wanted to see if you'd stumbled on anything useful. You're a practical man, Jack. You'd know if something here had value beyond creaking floorboards. Jack finally spoke, his voice low and even. There's nothing here for you, Evan. Go back to shore. Evan looked at him, a flash of irritation breaking through the practiced charm, but he recovered quickly. If that's what you say. Still, I think you'll find that places like this don't hold forever. Secrets have a way of surfacing. When they do, you'll need someone who knows how to handle them. Think about that. He glanced once more around the room, eyes lingering a little too long on the hearth before turning toward the door. Enjoy the quiet, cousin. It won't last. He left with the same careless wave, descending the path to his rented skiff. Jack and Scout stood in the doorway watching until the engine carried Evan back toward the mainland, the sound of it fading against the crash of waves. Jack closed the door firmly, his jaw tight. He bent down to Scout, rubbing the fur between his ears. He knows too much already, Jack murmured. The dog pressed his head against Jack's hand, steady and resolute. Jack looked toward the stone hearth, knowing Evan's words had confirmed what Henry had warned family could not be trusted. The secrets buried in this house were already drawing eyes that should never see them. The sky had been calm only hours earlier, a stretch of pale blue broken by soft clouds, but by late afternoon the horizon darkened with alarming speed. Jack Carter noticed the shift while securing the last of the rope along the landing, his senses sharpened by years at sea. The wind changed direction with a force that pressed against his chest, carrying the taste of brine and the weight of an oncoming squall. Scout lifted his head and let out a low growl, a sound that always seemed to arrive before the storm itself. Jack turned toward the mainland, and his stomach tightened when he saw Evan Miller's rented skiff had returned, only this time with 2 men aboard. Evan stood at the bow, gesturing sharply as the vessel fought the rising swell. Behind him, a tall, broad-shouldered man hunched over the tiller while a wiry companion clutched a canvas sack. The timing could not have been worse. Jack signaled from the rocks that the weather was turning, but Evan waved him off and barked something to his men that was carried away by the wind. Minutes later, the skiff slammed against the landing with a hollow crack, nearly capsizing in the mounting waves. Evan and his companions scrambled onto the slick stone soaked to the bone. The storm's closing in, Jack warned, voice steady, though the wind tore at every syllable. You won't make it back across in this weather. Evan's grin was strained, his eyes restless. Then we stay. It'll give me a chance to look around properly. The larger man introduced curtly as Roy carried himself like hired muscle, his silence heavy, while the smaller one, named Finn, had quick darting eyes that never stopped moving. Together they followed Jack up the path as sheets of rain began to fall. Scout pressed close at Jack's side. Hackles raised his presence a warning without words. The house groaned as the gale struck shutters slamming against their hinges, water forcing its way through cracks. Jack lit 2 lanterns and set them on the table, their glow fighting the shadows. Evan paced the room, muttering about the wasted fortune hidden here, while Finn examined the corners with nervous hands, and Roy stood near the door, broad chest rising like a bellows. Scout lay low near the hearth, but kept his eyes locked on the stranger's muscles coiled. The storm raged outside with deafening power waves hammering the ledge so hard the floor seemed to tremble. Evan tried to mask his unease with bravado, speaking too loudly about how their grandfather must have hidden more than books and maps. Jack ignored the bait, keeping his focus on the sea's rhythm and the men's movements inside the room. Then it happened without warning. Finn's hand slipped into his jacket and came out with the gleam of a blade, his wiry frame tense as he lunged toward Jack with reckless speed. The lantern light flashed along the knife's edge as it cut through the air. But Scout moved first. With a sound that ripped through the howl of the storm, the German shepherd sprang forward, body low and fast, intercepting the strike before it reached Jack's chest. His teeth clamped on Finn's arm, forcing the blade aside, the impact sending the man stumbling against the wall. Finn cried out in shock, dropping the knife as Scout held him pinned with a snarl that left no doubt about his intent. Jack's instincts took over his hand, striking the knife away across the floor before Roy or Evan could react. Roy shifted forward, fists clenched, but Jack's voice cut through the chaos. "Stay back." The command carried the weight of training, the tone of a man who had led men under fire, and for a moment even Roy hesitated. Evan raised his hands as though to calm the scene, but his eyes betrayed him, calculating rather than afraid. The storm pounded harder, the roof above groaning with strain. Scout released Finn only when Jack gave a quiet word, stepping back but keeping his body between Jack and danger. Finn cradled his arm, face twisted in pain and fury, but he made no move to lunge again. "This place isn't yours to take," Jack said evenly, breathing hard but voice steady. "You brought trouble into a house already tested by the sea, and you'll respect its rules if you want to see daylight again." Evan laughed nervously, though sweat beaded his forehead. "No need for dramatics. Tensions rise in storms, that's all. Let's sit. Let's wait it out." But Jack knew better. The storm outside was violent, but the greater danger sat within these walls. He moved to the window, checked the shutters, and glanced at Scout. The dog's chest heaved his growl a low hum beneath the roar of the wind, but his eyes never left the intruders. The storm would trap them here through the night, 4 men and a dog inside a fragile house perched on stone. Jack's mind worked quickly. He could not fight them all outright, not with the storm cutting off escape. But he had allies. Henry had left him. The walls, the hidden places, and, above all, Scout's instincts. He tightened the lantern wick, casting brighter light across the maps still spread on the table, and let the gale scream against the house. The storm was not their enemy. It was cover, a force that might yet turn the balance. Scout shifted closer to Jack Tail, stiff, ready for the next command. Jack rested a hand briefly on his head, and the silent bond between them steadied him. He would hold the line until dawn, no matter the storm outside or the storm within. The storm hammered the ledge through the night, tearing at the shutters and shaking the beams. But Jack Carter stayed alert with Scout pressed close at his side. Evan and his hired men had retreated to a corner, muttering among themselves, Finn nursing the bite on his arm and Roy glaring like a man waiting for the right chance. Jack kept to the table with the maps and the lantern, watching the rhythm of the storm through the walls, each vibration carried up through the stone like a drumbeat. By dawn, the rain slackened, though the wind still cut like blades. Jack used the lull to examine the maps once more, his eyes running over the coded notes Henry had drawn. One symbol appeared again and again near the foundation of the house, marked with a small circle and the number 3. He traced it with his finger, wondering what his grandfather had meant. At that moment, Scout lifted his head and gave a sharp bark, not of alarm, but of insistence. The shepherd stood padded across the room to the hearth, then turned left toward the far wall and barked again, tail stiff and nose close to the floorboards. Jack followed, his pulse quickening. He knelt, pressing his hand against the floor, feeling for the shift in sound. Tapping gently, he heard the hollow echo of empty space beneath. He glanced at the map again, Circle 3 drawn right where the house met the bedrock. Henry had marked an entrance. Jack fetched the pry bar and worked the boards loose while Scout watched intently. Beneath was a narrow gap leading downward, cold air rising through it with the faint smell of stone and rust. He widened the opening enough to slip through, lantern in hand. Scout followed, moving with the certainty of a guide who had known this path before. They descended into a chamber carved into the granite itself, walls smooth from tools that had labored long ago. The space opened into a vaulted hollow where shelves lined with waterproof cases stood neatly in rows. Jack lifted the lantern higher, and the glow revealed binders' reels of magnetic tape boxes marked with naval insignia. He stepped forward, set the lantern on a ledge, and pulled free a heavy folder sealed in wax. When he opened it, the truth struck him with the weight of history. Inside were charts of the North Atlantic from the height of the Cold War. Every major shipping lane traced, every submarine passage carefully noted. There were tide cycle logs, current measurements, and sound surveillance records annotated in Henry's hand. Jack's breath caught as he turned page after page, realizing his grandfather had not merely been listening, he had been building a record that rivaled official naval archives. Scout nosed another crate tail, thumping once, and Jack opened it to find sealed canisters labeled with sonar recordings. The handwriting was Henry's, precise and unbroken across decades. Jack realized the scale of what lay here. This was not eccentric hobby. This was intelligence hidden beneath a house on a rock, protected by silence. He dug deeper into the collection and found a file marked with his grandfather's initials. Inside lay a typed report with a handwritten addendum. The report detailed underground freshwater reserves beneath the ledge, a rare resource in mid-coast Maine, carefully mapped with notations on depth and flow. The addendum in Henry's handwriting read, "This site is more than stone. It offers life. Guard it." Jack leaned against the stone wall, the lantern's light flickering across his face as realization sank in. The ledge was not just valuable because of history or nostalgia. It was strategically vital, an observation post during one of the most dangerous eras of the century, a fresh water source hidden from plain view, and a listening station still functional if restored. Jack ran a hand over his jaw, hearing Henry's words again, "Only one who understands the sea should keep it." He looked at Scout, who sat steady and silent, watching him as if waiting for the next command. "You knew," Jack whispered. The dog blinked slowly, then shifted closer, his head brushing Jack's arm. Jack packed a few of the files into his rucksack, choosing those most vital shipping routes, sonar records, water resource maps. He would need proof to show the authorities one day, but for now, secrecy was still his only shield. He replaced the other crates, carefully aware that Evan's curiosity had already been piqued, and the less he revealed upstairs, the longer this secret would remain safe. Climbing back into the house, Jack closed the boards and weighted them with stone. Scout sat on guard while he secured the maps inside his pack. Outside, the wind had begun to shift again, signaling the storm's retreat. Jack straightened, ready for the confrontation he knew would come. Evan would not leave quietly, not after suspecting there was more hidden than Jack admitted. Jack rested his hand on Scout's back, steadying both of them. The storm had revealed the path. Now came the harder part, protecting it. The day after the storm, the ledge was quiet but uneasy. The sea rolled heavy and gray, as if keeping secrets beneath its shifting skin. Jack Carter had barely slept, his mind replaying what he had found in the chamber under the house. He had packed away the most critical files and hidden them where only he and Scout could find them again. But Evan Miller had been watching with the eyes of a man who sensed treasure and would not rest until he held it in his hands. Jack knew a confrontation was coming. He just did not know when. It came sooner than he expected. Evan waited until Roy and Finn busied themselves near the broken landing, repairing the rope lines frayed by the storm. He approached Jack with a smile that was stretched too thin, words soft but edged like glass. "Cousin, I couldn't help but notice the way you've been guarding that pack. You've found something, haven't you, grandfather's secret? The reason he wasted half his fortune out here. Why don't you share it? We're family, after all." Jack said nothing, only turned away to secure the shutters still creaking in the wind. Scout followed his movement, eyes fixed on Evan with a low growl humming deep in his chest. Evan stepped closer, his tone shifting to frustration. "You think you can keep it to yourself? That old man left more than a shack. He left information, something worth more than any house or shipping company. I know it, and I want my part." Before Jack could respond, Evan lunged for the pack sitting on the table. The motion was sudden, desperate, and reckless. He yanked it open, pulling at the folders inside, scattering maps across the floor. The lantern, still burning nearby, wobbled and fell its flame licking across the edge of a map. In an instant, fire caught the paper, curling it black. Jack rushed forward to snuff it out, his hands slapping the flames, but Evan twisted away, clutching another folder to his chest. "It's mine!" he shouted, though his voice cracked with panic. The flames spread across the wooden floor toward more documents. Scout reacted with the speed of instinct. The shepherd launched forward, jaws clamping around Evan's wrist, forcing him to release the folder before it could be destroyed. Evan screamed, his grip loosening the papers, falling free into Jack's reach. Jack stamped out the fire with his boot heart racing as the last flickers died. The air filled with smoke, the acrid scent stinging his throat, but the documents were saved. Jack turned in time to see Evan shove Scout away, his face twisted in fury. "You'll regret this." Evan spat his breath ragged. The fight moved outside in a rush of chaos. Evan bolted toward the cliff's edge, hoping to find a path, or maybe to throw Jack's pack into the sea. Jack caught up, pulling him back, the two men grappling on the slick stone. Rain still wet from the storm made the surface treacherous, and the sea below churned with relentless force. Evan's strength came from desperation, his hands clawing at Jack's shirt, pushing, straining for leverage. Jack planted his boots firm, holding the line, but Evan's fury grew wild. With a sudden violent shove, Evan drove Jack backward toward the edge. Jack's boots slipped, the world tilting as the void of the sea opened below him. His arms flailed for purchase, the stone beneath his feet crumbling. Then Scout moved. The shepherd lunged, teeth gripping the fabric of Jack's jacket muscles, straining with all his weight. Jack felt the sudden pull, the anchor against the fall. He dropped to one knee, regaining balance, his body trembling with the nearness of death. The sound of waves crashing far below thundered in his ears, a reminder of what almost was. Evan stared in shock, his chest heaving, his face pale. For a heartbeat, the fight seemed to pause, silence broken only by the sea. Then Jack rose. Scout pressed close at his side, both steady and unbroken. Evan stumbled backward, his bravado slipping into fear. Roy and Finn had appeared at the path drawn by the noise, but neither moved to help their employer. They watched with wary eyes, uncertain now that the balance had shifted. Jack looked at Evan with a calm born of training, his voice low but clear. "You almost destroyed what you don't understand. These papers aren't wealth to be divided. They're responsibility, and you're not worthy of them." Scout growled once more, deep and final, the sound cutting through the salt-heavy air. Evan opened his mouth as if to argue, then closed it, his breath ragged. He had seen enough to know this was no prize he could seize. The sea roared below, the ledge trembled with the crash of waves, and Jack realized the moment of truth was still ahead. Saving the documents was only the beginning. What lay within them had the power to alter more than family greed. It could decide the safety of coastlines and the legacy of Henry Carter himself. And the storm that mattered now was not in the sky, but in the choices yet to come. The night after the confrontation was long filled with the echoes of waves crashing against the ledge and the weight of what had nearly been lost. Jack Carter had secured the documents once more, storing them carefully in the chamber his grandfather had carved beneath the house. Scout lay by his side, ears twitching at every sound, his steady breathing a reassurance in the darkness. Jack thought of Henry Carter's warnings of the coded notes and careful instructions, and realized his grandfather had not trusted only him, but had built precautions into the rock itself. As Jack closed the reinforced door to the chamber, he heard a faint electronic click, a sound out of place against the silence of stone. He froze, lantern raised, and saw a small panel above the entrance flicker with a dim red light. It pulsed once, twice, then steadied, humming faintly. Scout tilted his head, giving a soft bark as though sensing its importance. Jack stepped closer and recognized what it meant. Henry had built a signal system, a silent alarm hidden within the ledge itself. By opening the chamber fully, he had triggered a transmission. He did not know where it led, but the knowledge filled him with a strange sense of relief. His grandfather had not relied only on secrecy. He had built in protection, a way to call for help long after his own watch had ended. The storm outside had exhausted itself by dawn. When Jack stepped out onto the porch, the sea stretched calm and gleaming, the horizon washed in the first gold of sunrise. Scout trotted ahead, paws damp from the morning dew, ears alert. The air was sharp and clean, carrying the scent of renewal. But Jack's peace lasted only moments. A low hum reached his ears, the unmistakable sound of engines. He looked out across the water and saw two vessels approaching, one bearing the markings of the Coast Guard, the other a gray naval ship. Their silhouettes cut sharp against the morning sky, purposeful and steady. Scout barked once, tail high, and Jack felt the weight of inevitability settle on his shoulders. His grandfather's system had done its work. Help had come. By the time the vessels anchored in the cove, Evan Miller's confidence had collapsed. The sight of armed officers disembarking left him pale, his bravado stripped away like a costume under harsh light. Roy and Finn exchanged nervous glances, but it was Evan who tried to speak first, stepping forward with trembling hands raised. "This is a misunderstanding," he stammered. "We were just visiting, just checking on family." But his words rang hollow. The officers had already received the transmission, the signal Henry had designed, and knew they were answering a call linked to classified material. They moved with quiet efficiency, separating the men and searching the premises. Jack stood tall with Scout at his side, offering no resistance, only clarity. He explained what he had found, the files, the records the chamber built into the granite. He did not embellish, did not dramatize. He simply told the truth the same way he had reported in uniform years ago. The senior officer, a stern but calm man with silver at his temples, listened with measured attention. He identified himself as Admiral Hayes, once a colleague of Henry Carter, a man who had known his grandfather's brilliance during the Cold War. His gaze softened when he looked at Jack, recognizing both the burden and the loyalty carried across generations. "Your grandfather trusted you for a reason," Hayes said quietly. "He believed you could continue the watch without letting ambition or greed corrupt it." The outcome was swift. Evan Miller was taken into custody, his protests drowned by the sound of orders given with finality. The charges were clear: unauthorized entry, attempted theft, and the intent to sell classified information. Roy and Finn, though complicit, were treated as hired hands with less responsibility, their fear now plain. As they were led down to the waiting boats, Evan shot Jack one last look, a mixture of resentment and disbelief, as though unable to accept that loyalty could outweigh greed. Jack did not return the look. His focus was on the horizon where the sea shimmered with light. Hayes remained behind for a moment longer. He placed a hand on Jack's shoulder, firm and respectful. "The ledge will remain yours," he said. "Not as a prize, but as a responsibility. The files will be secured and catalogued, but this post, this place, it needs a guardian. You and Scout have already proven you are that guardian." Jack felt the weight of the words, but also a quiet sense of purpose. For years he had struggled to find a place where his vigilance meant something, where his training and his silence had value. Now he stood on solid ground, not as an exile, but as a sentinel. That evening, after the ships had departed and the ledge was quiet once more, Jack sat on the repaired porch with Scout leaning against his leg. The sea was calm, the gulls circling lazily above, and the air held the freshness of renewal. The old house still groaned in the wind, but it was no longer just a ruin. It was a post, a home, and a promise. Jack rested a hand on Scout's back, feeling the steady warmth of the shepherd's loyalty. "We did it," he whispered. "And now we keep watch." Scout gave a low, contented sound, his amber eyes reflecting the glow of the setting sun. As the horizon burned with colors of dusk, Jack understood that his life had shifted forever. No longer drifting between memories of war and the silence of exile, he now held a purpose rooted in both duty and peace. The storm had passed. The danger had been faced, and what remained was a quiet strength shared between a man and his dog standing guard on a ledge that was no longer just stone in the sea, but a beacon of loyalty and trust. That was today's story from the rocky coast of Maine. What do you think was Scout the true hero of this tale, or was it Jack's strength that carried them through? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments and let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoyed the journey, make sure to hit like and subscribe so you don't miss the next story.